I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, Tilo, Emilia, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H., Y. Kellerman, Saaded 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, I need to remind you before we get to the meat and potatoes of this edition of the show that I am currently without an advertiser, and I need your help to keep this show going. You need to go over on Patreon, or if you can, I shouldn't say need because these can be tough times for a lot of us, but if you can, support me financially on patreon.com/parallaxviews. It would be greatly appreciated. You do not even know. Like I said, I'm without an advertiser right now. So it is you, the listener, that are keeping this show afloat. I could really use the donations. I'm trying to put the best content out there during this election season. And, I just really need the support right now. So patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that out of the way, on this edition of the show, Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter David Cay Johnston of the DC Report returns to discuss a subject he is rather familiar with, namely Donald Trump. You see, David has written about Donald Trump for over 30 years now, starting in 1988. He's the author of the books The Making of Donald Trump, It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America, and The Big Cheat, How Donald Trump Fleeced America and Enriched Himself and His Family. But this isn't just going to be a conversation going over David's reporting on Donald Trump. We're going to tie it in with his earlier work on issues related to inequality in America. You see, before writing those books on Donald Trump, David wrote 4 books that will be pretty central to our conversation. They are 2003's Perfectly Legal, The Covert Campaign to Rig Our Tax System to Benefit the Super Rich and Cheat Everybody Else, 2007's Free Lunch, How the Wealthiest Americans Enrich Themselves at Government Expense and Stick You with the Bill, 2012's The Fine Print, How Big Companies Use quote-unquote plain English to rob you blind, and 2014's Divided, The Perils of Our Growing Inequality. In those books and in David's reporting, he reveals that there is a hidden system, hidden because not a lot of people have reported on it and looked into the arcane details of it, that has led to a redistribution of wealth away from the many and into the hands of the few. Donald Trump, he says, is the embodiment of this. He embodies that system. And we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of it. We're going to tie it all together in this conversation. I've spoken with David before, but I think this is probably the best interview I've done with David Cay Johnston. So, with that being said, let's get right to it. Welcome back to Parallax Views, a guest that I always enjoy having on. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter and the co founder of DC Report. There's probably some things I've left out there because he's done so much over his really long and great career. David Cay Johnston, how are you doing?
Great. Just
So,
great.
I wanted to have you back on to talk about the election and also just what I'm seeing from the Republican side, where, these characters like J.D. Vance are pretending that they're the friend of the working class. They had that Teamsters union leader at the RNC, and I think they're trying to pull the wool over our eyes because, the Trump agenda, in my view, is not pro working class at all. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, Donald has never been in support of working class people. He has spoken against unions in the past. He has a long history of employing, to use his language, illegals, and then refusing to pay them. He has been the subject of a federal trial over failure to pay as promised to about 400 workers. And at the end of the trial, the federal judge ruled that Trump's testimony had no credibility. No credibility, a pretty damning statement. Donald's only significant legislative achievement was the 2017 tax cut. That tax cut works against ordinary Americans. Your federal income tax may have gone down a smidgen if you make less than $500,000 a year, but the money that was turned over to corporations and the very wealthy by not requiring them to pay as much in tax was all borrowed money. And that money is distributed against all of us. So, if you're in favor of going into debt with the government credit card so that Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos can pay less in taxes, I would say Donald Trump is the person you want in office.
So, I wanted to ask you about this because I haven't heard other interviewers ask you about it as much. You've written three books about Trump now, but before that, you wrote the books Perfectly Legal, The Covert Campaign to Rig Our Tax System to Benefit the Super Rich and Cheat Everybody Else. You wrote Free Lunch, How the Wealthiest Americans Enrich Themselves at Government Expense and Stick You with the Bill. And you wrote The Fine Print, How Big Companies Use Plain English to Rob You Blind. And I should also mention there's a fourth book, Divided, The Perils of Our Growing Inequality. How is there a connective tissue between those four books and the books you've written on Trump?
Well, yes, in that Donald is the embodiment of this hidden in plain sight system we have that takes from the many and redistributes to the very few. And people aren't aware of this because it's well hidden in the law. It's there. I was able to dig these facts out, and nobody has challenged a single fact in any of the books that you've mentioned, the three Trump books, the four books on economics, or for that matter, my very first book, Temples of Chance, about the casino industry, and about 40% of that book is about Trump. But these aren't facts that are being discussed every day by the politicians. These are facts that I had to do arduous work digging out of the public record. And in Donald Trump, you have the embodiment of the policies that I wrote about in my economics books. And let me give you a real simple example of this. Every time you turn on a stove with natural gas to make coffee, boil the water, or you put gas or diesel in your car, embedded in the price you pay are the costs of transporting fossil fuels by pipeline. That's the most efficient way to move fossil fuels. I'm not objecting to pipelines per se. But the pipeline companies are all legal monopolies. And as such, they are regulated. Not as much as I think they should be, but they're regulated. And as a result, like all regulated monopolies, like your local electricity distributor or your local natural gas or water provider, assuming they're corporate, not government, we have to include the income taxes the corporation will owe to the government. Let's say we need to give you $1 billion to pay your income taxes. Well, actually, that won't do it because then you'd only get 79% of that. This is a 21% tax rate. It used to be a 35% rate, and one time when I was a young man, a 50% rate. So if it's a 35% rate, we actually would have to give you $1.54 billion for you to net $1 billion. Well, here's the problem nobody knew till I dug it out of the public record. The pipeline companies are exempt under a Ronald Reagan law from the corporate income tax. So we pay them the tax, what's called the gross up on the tax. That is not the billion they owe, but the $1.154 billion. And they don't even turn the money over to the government. Now, how much money is that? Well, if you could force, as these companies do by law, every person in America to give you a penny a day, at the end of the year, you would have $1.2 billion in your pocket. I calculated that the pipeline companies were collecting a little over $3 billion a year this way. A couple of fossil fuel lawmakers got ticked off about this. It was in the New York Times when I was a reporter there. They had a study done by Congress's staff experts on this, and they concluded that it was only $2 billion a day. Okay, $2 billion, $3 billion, it's a lot of money to them, but to you and me, it's 2 or 3 pennies a day. And 2 or 3 pennies here and a nickel there and a quarter somewhere else and $1 in another place. And pretty soon a handful of people are getting richer and richer and richer through government policies you've never heard of. And look how long it took to explain to you one of the simplest devices I just exposed. A lot of people can't follow even that simple case. So Donald Trump comes along and is promoting putting these redistribution to the rich policies on steroids.
If you could, how would you compare what Trump did in his term to, say, what Joe Biden has done with his administration? Because I think there has been a lot of good work done on, challenging monopoly capital and antitrust stuff. So I think that gets overlooked.
So Donald ran for office, not really expecting to win by his own account, and literally knowing nothing. I mean, one of the things Donald has pulled the public's eyes over is he keeps saying how smart he is, how educated he is. He's incredibly ignorant. This is a man who doesn't know why there is a USS Arizona Memorial in Pearl Harbor, just for starters. How can you not know what December 7th, 1941 is a date that will live in infamy? And he promised, if elected, that he was going to build a wall on the southern border that would stop all immigration, number one. And number two, that they pass a massive infrastructure bill because our roads and bridges and whatnot are all falling apart from lack of maintenance and improvement and replacement. Well, he never even introduced an infrastructure bill. Never happened. Never even put one in. Joe Biden got one passed, even though he only had a 5-vote margin in the House. Trump said he was going to build this impenetrable wall. Well, most of what he did was to repair existing wall, but where he did build new wall, it was so impenetrable that people on the Mexican side of the border went to Home Depot, bought electric saws, and cut through in a matter of seconds. Other people threw up ladders and came right over the top. And there's video you can find about this on the internet. Furthermore, you can't build a wall along the entire border because of the way it's laid out. And one of his children, Don Jr., was involved up to his eyeballs in the fake wall building charity that DC Report exposed. We were the first to reveal that it was a fraud. And the key organizer, a war vet and an amputee, I don't know if he has gone to prison yet or will be going, but he will end up in prison. It was just a straight out scam. So Donald Trump had no accomplishments except taking from the many to give to the rich, reverse Robin Hood tax law. On the other hand, Joe Biden has gotten the Inflation Reduction Act, the Build Back Better America Act, and 4 or 5 other major pieces of legislation passed, And what happened to the US economy? Well, we had a brief spurt of inflation. Inflation of a kind that happens after wars, after other disruptive events. Inflation hit for the year over 7%. And now it's back down to under 3%, which is below the average since World War II. And yet you will hear Republicans all the time saying that prices have gone up 4 and 5 times. No, they haven't. Overall, they've gone up 20%, which is a lot. On the other hand, wages have gone up almost as much. And for people in the bottom half, many of them have gotten very substantial raises relative to their pay. We have, under Donald Trump, what's called CapEx, capital expenditures by companies. That is how much you're investing in new manufacturing plants. And I'm just talking about manufacturing here. 3 of the 4 years Trump was president, capital expenditures on new or expanded or improved factories fell. They fell 3 of the 4 years. Under Joe Biden, they went up again. And in the 3rd year of his administration, they went up almost 50%. The increase that we will see when the data is available for 2024 is probably greater than the total when Trump took office of capital investment in new manufacturing. Under Biden, there have been more jobs created than all Republican presidents since World War II. The Republicans have a very bad history with job creation, even though lots of people don't know that. The stock market does better under a Democrat in the White House than under a Republican. And to anyone listening who goes, I've never heard that, the data is on the internet. You can go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and look up all jobs or all non-government jobs, bls.gov. A number of people have taken a chart I did 15 years ago on job growth by president and have updated it. You can find those. Just put in a search in an internet search engine, Bing or Google, jobs by president. And you'll see that overwhelmingly job creation is under Democratic presidents. Trump was the first president since Herbert Hoover to leave office with fewer jobs than when he came in. And let's not forget why that happened. I wrote 2 years before the pandemic, 2 years. Should a pernicious virus like the one that killed Donald Trump's father start hopscotching around the planet on jetliners, Trump won't know what to do. And along comes the pandemic, and what does Trump do? Well, we should inject bleach. We need to put light inside our bodies somehow. You should take a horse dewormer, which some people did and died from doing. He utterly and completely mishandled this, and it all began because Barack Obama, a very subtle and brilliant mind, Barack Obama had created an office in the White House in the National Security Operation to be on the lookout for early signs of a pandemic. All those staff were immediately dismissed when Donald Trump became president. Trump said, who knew we could have this happen? I studied in the 1960s in one course, just one course, but that we would have a pandemic in my lifetime that might well kill 50, 100 million people, lots of people. That this was a known problem. We'd already had SARS and the Middle Eastern virus that killed, as best we can tell, 1 of every 3 people who got infected with it. Luckily, that was shut right down. And Donald Trump's incompetence essentially killed 900,000 Americans. And I come to that number by simply saying, here's how many people died in South Korea, which got its first COVID case the same day we did. And the population of South Korea expanded to equal our population. And by the way, South Korea is much, much more densely populated than America. I mean, it's much more like living in Manhattan in most parts of South Korea than in the US, where we have lots of space. And if you take the South Korean rate of COVID death and apply it to the US, you end up with less than 200,000 dead people. I think it may even be, it's a little over 100,000 dead people. So Donald Trump's signature accomplishments were killing 900,000 people, which is why at DC Report we used to run something called the Trump Death Tracker every day, and a tax bill that it uses borrowed money to redistribute from all of us to the relative handful of very rich people at the top and lower their taxes. And there's no comparison between the two. You know, Donald Trump goes around saying Joe Biden is the worst president in American history. He's doing what he always does. He's talking about himself. He knows perfectly well that he was the worst president in American history. And certainly on an economic basis, hands down, there's nobody in his category of economic damage, death, and destruction.
I was going to say, you've also written about his view on minimum wage. You wrote a whole piece on this back in February 2020 for the DC Report. Could you talk about his views on the minimum wage?
Well, in 1993, Bill Clinton, newly elected to the White House, and someone whom I would describe as what used to be known as a liberal Republican as opposed to a Democrat, Bill Clinton made a deal with Herman Cain, who was the chief lobbyist for the Restaurant Association. Now, the Restaurant Association is a very big, powerful lobby. Think how many restaurants there are in your neighborhood or your town. And the deal was that the minimum wage for tipped staff, so waitresses, waiters, bartenders, barbacks, busboys, people like that, is set forever unless Congress acts at $2.13 an hour. In 2024 dollars, that's 98 cents. 98 cents an hour. That's your pay. Now, the federal minimum wage is $7.25. So to fill that in, the first $6.27 of tips you get each hour just cover the minimum wage to bring you up to $7.25. And by the way, the minimum wage has not been changed since, which was last raised by George W. Bush, a Republican, has not increased since 2009, and it's now worth less than $5 an hour in 2024 dollars. So the amazing thing is when a proposal came up to address this minimum wage and this inequity, Donald went so far over the top that I think the headline in our piece said, Donald, at $2.13 an hour, Donald thinks this waitress is paid too much. If you want to understand how Donald Trump is absolutely an enemy of the people he says he loves, and Donald doesn't love anybody, including himself, all you have to do is look at that. $2.13 an hour minimum wage, and then you have to make it up with tips. Now, by the way, if there aren't enough tips to cover the minimum wage, the employer's on the hook for them. But you're basically giving your employer the first $6.27 of your tips each hour. And one of the reasons employers in restaurants really would like you to pay with a credit card, even though they pay a fee for the credit card, is it lets them track this and lowers their cost to $2.13 an hour. You have not seen this story in the mainstream press. It's not like my former editors at the New York Times, and I think very highly of the New York Times. Flaws and all, is far and away the best newspaper the world's ever had. No one has the capacity to report like the Times does. But the New York Times is, in the words of its former executive editor, Howell Raines, the daily newsletter of the American establishment. It's how they communicate with each other. And while it runs stories about poor people, it runs stories about inequities and all of that, the fundamental tenor of the news is much more about diplomacy, geopolitics, things like that. It's not about the day-to-day struggles of people who have too little. And certainly the policy issues, if Kamala Harris were to start attacking the $2.13 pay, it would be news coverage in a campaign. But unless some independent force brings it up, other than a one-off article, you will not see this written about in any or reported on TV by any of the big news organizations. And if you were to try and make it a regular part of your stories as a journalist, you would be told, you've reported that. You've reported it 3 times. It's old news. You're being tendentious. And there are few words more scorning of a journalist in a newsroom than to say your work is tendentious. If you don't know the word, look it up, because it will tell you why you don't want editors thinking you are tendentious.
There are just two more things I wanted to ask you about. And the first thing is a bit of a complicated question. For all the Republican Party under Trump talks about, we're for the working people and, we're against the elites, it's just every time you look into what they are actually doing, it's the opposite. So, Josh Hawley says that he wants copyright reform, which I think there should be copyright reform, but then you look into it and it's just about targeting Disney for being against the Don't Say Gay bill that DeSantis was involved in Florida. Or you look at JD Vance and the real safety stuff. Well, he helped weaken that real safety bill at the request of lobbyists. And I have the news articles on this, and it just seems like this party is a party that doesn't actually want to do anything with policy, and really its main goal seems to be to facilitate wealth transfers rather than do anything for the public.
Well, if you look back over American history since the Civil War, America, was born as an agrarian country. We then became industrialized after the Civil War, and by 1900 we're the leading economy in the world. Around 1975, we began transiting into the current era of a digital economy, and we're now on the cusp of becoming a genetic or biological economy, which will produce vastly more fortunes than the digital economy, because people will pay a lot more to, grow a new limb or not die of heart disease than they will for a computer. And the Republicans have consistently, since the Civil War, been the party of business. They have been the supporters of business. That's perfectly fine. I don't have any fundamental problem with that. The Democrats were the party of working people, particularly beginning with FDR, who took office in March of 1933. Unfortunately, the campaign finance system has warped all of this. After the Richard Nixon Watergate scandals and all the dirty money that was discovered, we passed at state and federal level a whole bunch of reforms. I wrote about these. I was with the Detroit Free Press in Lansing, the state capital at the time, and Michigan passed the toughest campaign reform law in America. It was a really tough bill. And all of that has backfired. It has enhanced the power of a very narrow set of donors. A vastly disproportionate share of campaign contributions come out of a relative handful of zip codes in Manhattan and Los Angeles County. And it has, through the Supreme Court decisions that essentially say money is free speech, billionaires and centimillionaires, people with $100 million or more, have gained enormous influence. And both parties now kowtow to donors much more than ordinary people. Combine that with the radical declines in both religious attendance, actual going to church, and the decimation of unions. Unions had 37% of private production workers in 1973. They're now down to 5%. The number you may hear in the news is higher because that's public employees. But on the private sector, it's only 1 in 20 workers who are in a union. And the result of this has been a weakening of the support structures for working people. Adam Smith, who just figured out modern market economics in his book, The Wealth of Nations, came out in 1776. It's still in print today. He pointed out that whenever working people talk about trying to get more money through a guild or a union, this is denounced. And in fact, asking as a group for a pay raise in this country until 1842 was a criminal act. A criminal act until Justice Joseph Story in Massachusetts changed that in 1842. On the other hand, Adam Smith wrote that the owners of factories and equipment and the means of production, to use Marx's term, the means of production, are always and everywhere engaged in a conspiracy to raise prices and lower wages. And that's all we're seeing going on, is very wealthy people are pursuing their own interests. There's nothing wrong with pursuing your own interests. It's sinful if you're being greedy, but per se, looking for laws that benefit you is something, it's just going to be part of our human nature. And people with a great deal of money, now that they are the most important factor to a politician in getting elected or reelected, because the Supreme Court equates wrongly dollars and free speech, have created a situation where the public debate we're having isn't about what do you and I and your neighbor 6 blocks away need from our government today. What can our government do? And let me just make one important point about this. All low-tax societies are poor. Look everywhere in the world at countries that have low taxes. Singapore appears to be, and is always touted as this super low-tax country with fabulous, incredible public services. That's because it has a hidden 80% tax on the capital of ordinary Singaporeans, something I exposed in 2011, and the government was going to indict for a criminal offense for reporting that fact, unless my then employer Reuters took it down, which they did everywhere but at Reuters India. The simple fact is the modern world requires massive investments in infrastructure, whether it's roads and bridges and dams and pipelines for water and sewer, or constructed infrastructure, that is research, medical systems, criminal justice systems, and those are very expensive. With those, you can create commonwealth, and everybody can prosper. If you build a new highway, everybody can use the highway. But what we've been doing for 50 years, and that's largely what my book Free Lunch was about, is we've been picking companies and saying, well, we're going to give you, Walmart, a subsidy for 90% of the distribution centers you build and about 1/3 of your stores. Hey, General Electric, we're going to let you keep the state income taxes paid by your Ohio workers making jet engines, and that will give you the money to rebuild your factory and modernize it. We're not going to get it from the Wall Street. We're not going to get it from our internal cash flow. We're going to get it from the taxpayers. And nobody knew about these things until I dug them out of the record and put them in there. I mean, obviously, a few people did. When I say nobody, I mean a tiny little itty-bitty sliver of Americans. And it still isn't in the public discourse. And what the Republicans stand for is redistribution to the rich. Their fundamental argument is the reason we don't have a better economy is the rich don't have nearly enough, and we have to get them more, and we have a way to get them more. We're going to take it from children, the disabled, the elderly, that is, people who can't fight back. And the Democrats are sort of trying to do the right thing, especially since Biden came into office and began pushing an agenda aimed at working people. He's the only president who ever walked a picket line. And Kamala Harris will do more of this than Biden has. She will continue that if she's elected to the White House. So, I think we have a real simple decision here. And I say this as somebody who was a registered Republican for 25 years. I've never been a Democrat or a Republican. I just voted in Republican primaries for 25 years, but I wasn't afraid to do that at JG. If you want a society that has more and more billionaires and more people who need to go to a food bank so they don't starve, then you should vote for Donald Trump. You should absolutely do that. That's what you're going to get. If you want a society that tells women they don't control their bodies, and by the way, a plan by the proposed incoming Trump administration to ban all contraceptives. If you go read Project 2025, one of the things you'll see is that you could only ship contraceptives, condoms, IUVs, etc., if you had your own fleet of trucks. You can't hire a trucking company, a common carrier, to move your stuff. How many people, even if they read this, when they got to the line about common carrier, would know what the heck that means? So, and if you want to have a society that is more broadly prosperous, that will have fewer people who are fallen by the wayside, then you want to vote for Biden and the Democrats. I mean, it's really very simple. It's very stark. This is not marginal little differences. These are huge differences.
I know you have to get going, but I just want to ask you this one last thing. You mentioned Project 2025, I know a lot of people are concerned with the Christian nationalism associated with it, the authoritarianism. You know what scares me, though, is A, it just seems like really libertarian in its views, like give more money to the rich, and also the effect it would have on infrastructure. Donald Trump a while back was talking about we had good H2O, which is really weird to
Right.
put it that way. But, I looked at Project 2025 and it's proposing restrictions on the EPA's ability to protect the public from these toxic PFAS or forever chemicals. This is going to be just horrible for consumers. A second Trump presidency.
Well, with the caution that the PFAS may be overblown as an issue, there certainly are chemical issues we need to be addressing, and the Europeans are doing it in a much more thoughtful way than we are. Project 2025 is something Donald Trump's trying to run away from. When it started, he endorsed it. He said, these are my people that are developing my plan. It's written by his people, including his minister of hate, Stephen Miller, in the immigration section. And Trump is now trying to distance himself from it because he's come to realize that it's not good for him in a campaign. But Donald distances himself from things all the time. He never had sex with Stormy Daniels, right? That's why he hid paying her $135,000. Didn't have a 5-month affair with the Playboy model Karen McDougal, who's talked all about it, and you paid her off not to talk. Yeah, right. Project 2025 is a plan, I would argue, not libertarian. Libertarians essentially want no government and everything by agreement between people and contracts. It is a plan for government of the rich, by the rich, and for the rich, so long as the controlling rich are white men. And literally, the woman who wrote the section about reproduction said there's a TV interview with her you can see, that we should ban all contraceptives. Now, I'm 75 years old. It's not like something central to my life, but really, you want to have a ban on contraceptives? If people know that, I don't understand how hardly anybody under the age of 50 would be in favor of that. It doesn't make sense. And yet that's what they want to do. And they don't want smaller government. They want a government that controls you, that limits. They propose literally arresting and imprisoning librarians for buying books that they don't like. And so, there was a survey recently, and this has been done in the past, where a random sample of people are asked questions. And one of them is, should we teach Arabic numerals in the schools? And every time I've ever seen it done, a majority of Americans, I think the most recent survey, it was like 2/3 of Americans, it might have been 3/4, said, no, we shouldn't do that. If people don't understand Arabic numerals are, when we write 1, 2, 3, those are Arabic numerals. They're the ones who invented our number system, was the Middle East. It's just an indication of ignorance and bias. And Project 2025 is 900 pages long. So it's the equivalent essentially of 3 novels if you were 3 nonfiction books. If you were reading, in fact, my books would be equivalent of 8 of them. All of them together are probably about 1 million words. Now, and they would run about, well, I take it back, be about 3 of my books, because they were each about 300 pages, 3 of my books. So what Donald Trump and the Republicans are counting on is ignorance. And here's what should scare you about what's gone wrong in this country. The most recent National Literacy Survey, now it was 5 years ago, things might have changed, but I doubt with the pandemic they got better. 54% of Americans read at the level of a 6th grader or below. 54%, more than half of Americans read at the level of a 12-year-old. And 22% of Americans read at the level of a 3rd grader or below. You want to know why newspapers aren't selling? People don't know how to read anymore as they used to be able to. You want to know why people embrace policies that are totally contrary to them? Because they don't understand them. The smartest 6th grader in your class when you were going to school didn't have the critical thinking ability to take apart complex public policy issues. And that's why Donald always says, I love the poorly educated. And the people who are poorly educated and are struggling in this country, they feel dumped on, and they should. They're dumped on by lifestyles of the rich and famous and glorification of a lot of money. They're ignored by most of the Democrats. They're dumped on by rich Republicans and the whole culture. If you're not rich, something is wrong with you, a twisted version of Christianity that's absurd. And so I think it's imperative that we pay attention and we improve a bunch of things. Fixing our education system is going to take a long time, but banning books isn't going to help. Demanding that we have leaders who are smart and educated. We don't want a country run by the Sarah Palins and the J.D. Vances. J.D. Vance has an education, but the things he's saying make it clear that he's a mess inside. And we need to have a society of people who are literate and reasonably well educated. And everybody ought to be able to read at the level of a high school student or maybe after 2 years of college. And by the way, that's the case in most of Europe. It's the case in most of Asia. My students, I'm a full-time professor at Rochester Institute of Technology. I used to be a half-time professor of law at Syracuse University College of Law. My students from China, without exception, are 2 or 3 magnitudes of intellectual capacity above my American students on the average. My very best American students are about equal with my weakest Chinese students. And China is going to run right past us, particularly because China has begun experimenting with Western-style education. Instead of whatever your professor says is the truth and you must just absorb this, they're allowing, on an experimental basis, students to challenge their professors. And I had the very good fortune of having 2 students who went through that system. And I told these 2 young women, I said, if the Chinese Communist Party adopts this broadly, China will run so fast past the rest of the world, we'll never catch up. Because you combine the discipline and obligation to learn with Western-style ability to challenge orthodoxy, which is threatening to the Communist Party, for sure. But if you combine those, oh my goodness, the places you can go. And we can't go anywhere if more than half of Americans read at the level of 6th grader or below.
Well, hey, David Cay Johnston, I want to thank you for coming on Parallax Views, dcreport.org, right?
That's right. And I'm no longer the publisher, but we're still doing great work there under the new management team.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with David Cay Johnston. I think it's probably the best interview I've done with David, and I thank him very much for the time. I know he's spoken a lot about Donald Trump lately, and in the past few years, actually, but I wanted to delve into those other works that he wrote before getting on the Trump beat so closely. I mean, he's been covering Trump for so long, but really, he's become most known for his Trump reporting in the last 2 years, and I think his books prior to that are very important and sort of act as a prequel of sorts to his work on Donald Trump. So I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I enjoyed conducting the interview. Let me know your thoughts on Twitter or email me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. And as always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. I won't belabor the point. I know I do that at the beginning of the show, but I really do need your support. Patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff. It's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.